I'm Elaine Wilson, and I have a special guest here with me today that we'll take a look at. His name is Tintoretto. Tintoretto is a nickname, and I'll be explaining that shortly to you. But if you haven't gotten a handout for this day's program, please don't hesitate to go to askpresenter.com or .org, the Willow Valley address. It's at the bottom of the screen. And you can quickly get one sent to you as I am speaking. And then the one for next week, I'll be reminding you about it at the end of this show today. There's a lot to talk about with all of these artists, as you're well aware, and I do want to add a disclaimer at the beginning here. Many times when I lecture on an artist, I know I'm not showing you your favorite work done by them if they're familiar to you. These artists have done hundreds of works during the course of their life. Last week, when I talked about Titian, he did between 250 and 400 paintings. I don't have time in an hour to fit all that in. So what I try to do is make them human. I try to give you some sense of how they lived and who they were and what they liked. And I also try to show you through examples of the work that they did, how they designed and how they created the pieces that they have given the world, which are just wonderful gifts for all of us. So let's take a look at the topic today, which is called A Brush on Fire, which is the work of Tintoretto. His name was actually Jacopo Robusti. Now, the cumin comes on a little later, and I'm going to try to cut back on how convoluted it was that they came up with his real last name. But let me just start by saying this is the length of time that he lived, into his 70s. He was born, and then I intentionally put in here, he stayed in Venice. Titian traveled around. He was an artist who actually was the first one with an international clientele. Tintoretto will not do that. Now, where does he get his nickname? His father was a dyer of cloth, and Jacopo would go down to his father's shop and he would draw pictures on the wall, and people would come in and they'd see, it was his oldest son, because in the family there were 21 children. They would see the work that the little guy was doing, and they started calling him Little Tintor or Tintoretto, and that is the name that stuck. Now, under his father's name, I don't have this word. I have cumin instead. We will advance 413 years until somebody in Spain, in Madrid, will come across some old yellowed papers because he's working on an exhibit of Tintoretto's work for In the Prado. And as he reads through the papers, he finds that this was the family name. Giovanni had been a brave fighter and defended the gates of the city at some point, and his fellow soldiers called him Giovanni Robusti, which means he was very brave. So the family took that as its name, and they never used that name. I said 413 years until we finally find out what his real name is. Now, his father is trying to secure a position for him and a future for him, and realizes that in the city of Venice, where they live, that Titian, who is 30 years older than his son, has a very powerful standing and a wonderful workshop. And he is able to smooth talk Titian into accepting his son as an apprentice. Well, that apprenticeship only lasted 10 days. And the stories go that Titian, who, as you're well aware from earlier lecture I gave on him, Titian had a very, very, very jealous streak. He didn't want anybody in that city to be as good an artist or to be thought of as being as good an artist. And so he noticed that when Tintoretto was drawing, that his skills were just unbelievable for somebody his age who supposedly had had no training. So after 10 days, Titian said, "You have to leave. I can teach you nothing." And that was the last that Tintoretto actually had formal training. Their competition between each other, and I'll speak about this in a little more in depth later, this competition between them will last until the day that Titian dies. As far as Tintoretto's family was concerned, he was married to a really supposedly beautiful woman named Faustina. And she was the daughter of a Venetian nobleman. Well, that didn't hurt Tintoretto's standing much. And they had an older daughter. Well, actually, they didn't have her. Tintoretto could not always be managed as a husband. And prior to their marriage, he had had an interlude of time with a German artist. And the German artist gave birth to Marietta in 1560. Faustina accepted this little girl into their family, and probably the German woman was happy to have that support because you don't hear about her again. Marietta is very happy with her adopted mother and with her real father. As far as not being able to manage her husband, Faustina managed all the money in the family. And when her husband was going out, she made sure that he wore the cloak of a nobleman because he was well respected, and she wanted to make sure that people knew that he should be able to maintain that respect from them. She put coins into a hanky and handed those to him, and she knew exactly how much money she'd given him. And when he came back, he was supposed to bring back the hanky with whatever money was left. You know, he would buy a drink or he'd have something to eat. Anyway, when he came back, he always sidestepped the report to Faustina by saying that whatever he had left, he had just handed off to some beggars that were in the street. So between the two of them, they had a good marriage. He was a very successful man. They lived well. But Faustina, and she stuck with him to the bitter end. But Faustina becomes the mother of Marietta, and then she and Tintoretto will have 2 sons and either 6 or 7 daughters, depending on what you read. When Marietta was small, and until she was the age of 15, she would dress, her father would have her dress as a boy, because that's the only way that she could go with him to his painting sites. She was very talented. She was a skilled artist. In some cases, historians know that she did paint on his father's canvases, but they can't tell which brushstrokes belong to which person. So the Venetian society was very stuffy at that point, and young women could certainly dabble in painting, but they certainly could not follow it as a career, which is, of course, Marietta's goal and the support that she could bring to her father at the same time. Her father, Tintoretto, out of the 21 children, was really the only one interested in all of the arts. In fact, he had Marietta signed up for music lessons and for singing lessons. She becomes very, very accomplished on the harpsichord, and he was very good. He had trained himself to play the lute as well as some other instruments, and he would and she would use their time together often just playing music, or while he was working, she would come into his studio, which was in his home, and she would just softly sing to him in the background, and nothing could have pleased him more. Faustina's 2 oldest children are boys, Domenico and Marco. Domenico is born the same year as Marietta. Marietta only lived to be 30 years old, and this really was, of all of the heartaches that a person can go through in life, for Tintoretto, this is the one that he felt the most deeply. Here he is on his knees by her bed, by her deathbed. She had married a nobleman, and the stipulation was that she would and her husband would live in Tintoretto's home until he died, because he wanted to keep her close to him. He absolutely adored him and the feeling was mutual. This is a picture that he had painted of her, and this is an etching that was done that shows the sorrow of the father with the end of the life of somebody that he just really admired, cared for, and had loved from the day she was born. Here are his early years. Had to self-train. Titian had thrown him out of the studio. Here's one of the sketches that he did. Now let me say a couple of things before we get to that. He would study and he would sketch the great masters of his time, and one of them that he looked with awe upon was Michelangelo. He also had the habit of making wax and clay models, and then he would use those models, and these were not just little tiny things you'd hold in your hand. These are good-sized models, and he would be able to move them and flex their positions so he could use those in paintings. This is curious, and it really did happen. There was a hospital near, and when there was an unclaimed corpse and the body was not being used by students to better understand the workings inside a human body, they would give him the corpse, and he would hang it in a box in his studio, and then he would practice drawing it. Now, I have to think that he didn't practice drawing it for days on end, but certainly it would give him a life-size model to work from for even a short period of time. He worked by daylight, and at night he would be in his studio and he would work by candlelight. And he would arrange the candlelight so that it reflected off of the clay models or the corpse in such a way that he could get the techniques down that he was interested in learning more about. He had a compulsion to draw. He drew all the time. He'd drawn since he was a tiny little boy in his father's dyeing shop. So he drew a lot. And when he started to do a painting, I called this the brush on fire. He did not do any preliminary sketches. He simply went to the canvas and attacked it with his brushes and worked furiously. One man said, I watched him work for 2 days. In 2 days, he accomplished more than I could accomplish in 2 years. It was a very, very fast, very definitive artist, and he could paint with a great deal of intention. Now, I want you to notice a couple of lines. Now, you may have seen them while I had this up here, and maybe not, so here they are. You see, this is a fairly large sketch of a human body. This is a man leaning back on his elbow. But what he would do is he would do the sketch and then he would block it with those lines that I just took off. And then he would take this paper out and he could put that beside the painting that he was working on, and voila, there it was. He had his image, and all he had to do was look over at it. He'd had experience working on all the parts of it, and he could just rapidly begin to paint. This is his home. It's a big house. They have a number of children. He has a studio in there. It's right on the canal in Venice. He would grow to become an extremely successful man, financially, and also be well known in the art world of Venice. But he did not travel beyond Venice. And one time, Charles IV of Spain saw a portrait that had been done by Marietta, and he said to Tintoretto, why don't you let her come to Spain and I will have her do some portraits of the royal family. And Tintoretto absolutely put his foot down. She was not to leave. She could not go. Everybody in his family was supposed to stay close to him. But he was extremely prolific. However, the bulk of his work is still in Venice, and you'll see why as we go along today. One of the things that attracted Impressionist artists and artists from later centuries to go to Venice to study the work that he had done was how he felt the pictures, how he seemed to put his emotion and drama and action into his paintings. He actually used the human body to show more about what the person was thinking and feeling than their facial expressions. This is the diversion from some of the other artists that you've seen or I've discussed with you, and certainly some of the ones that are coming along. Oh, he had interesting habits. He was very interested in his career, and he wanted to advance as fast as he possibly could, as fast as his brush could take him. So sometimes he'd work for free. He would only do this if he thought, for example, the family might have a need for portraits of everybody. So he would do one for free. And then, of course, he would get the commission to do all of the others as well, for which he would be well paid. Titian never got over being jealous of him. He was jealous of him all of his life. In public, he shunned him. He ignored his work. He undercut him every single chance he could. And Tintoretto was kind of flattered. He said, my goodness, I think he is a great artist. So if he is jealous of my work, I must be great too. There must be something about me that he finds to be very, very good and dangerous to him. So therefore, I think his shunning is perfectly okay. Tintoretto, though, was a little different from Titian. He liked to be alone. He liked to be in his studio by himself. And I imagine painting as fast and furiously as he did during the day, that he probably needed some downtime. And that's when he would play the lute, or Marietta would come in and be with him, but he didn't want company. He could be very gruff, he could be rude, he could be very insulting. And he wasn't really that kind of man. I mean, he wasn't tons of fun. He good jokes once in a while, but he wasn't a man who smiled a lot. However, he did like to be in his studio by himself with his plaster casts, with his clay models, and once in a while with one of the corpses as well. This church is not too far from where his home was located, and you can see there's a photograph of it on a canal. And here is actually the size of the church and the patio area in front. He will paint in this church in 1545, and it will be the site for where his tomb is located today. Now I need to show you something about his work, and I need to contrast that with Titian. This painting is called Presentation of the Virgin at the Temple. I'm going to show this one to you by Titian and make a few comments, and then I'm going to show you one by Tintoretto. And I do, as I flip to the other painting, I want you to have absorbed enough about this one to feel the emotional reaction and difference when you see what Tintoretto did and why they are so different and why artists would flock to study both of their works. Remember, Titian loved the Dolomite Mountains. That's where he came from, Cadore. It's back there, even though this is a scene that would have taken place in Israel. Titian liked to do comical things. Here's a little boy playing with a dog between these two figures that are right here. And if you know the story of the Virgin Mary, she was given by her family to the temple at an early age. And she would stay there until she was a young woman and of marriage age before she would leave. She would help with the temple. She learned the history of her people. She learned the history of the teachings of the Bible. And if you notice at the top of the stairs, Titian has included the two men that will be her overseers while she is living there. She's there until shortly before she's betrothed to Joseph. Now, watch what happens, folks, when I change the screen. Wow, look at that. Look at that. That's Tintoretto. They aren't anything alike. Notice what's going on here. It's the same presentation of the Virgin at the temple, but notice what's happening here. Here you have the small child moving up the steps towards the church authorities. But you have a lot of other things going on in this picture as well. Notice that even though this woman's head is turned towards her child, everything in this painting moves up those stairs. Tintoretto had a fascination with creating depth and interesting movement by how he placed figures and organized his composition. It's just an amazing change between the two of them. And Titian, as I said, never ever got over being jealous of Tintoretto, and Tintoretto never ever got over being kind of quietly amused that he was the object of Titian's jealousy. The city of the city of Venice has a patron saint, which is Saint Mark. And Saint Mark was he was the man that wrote the second gospel in the New Testament. He was not around during the time of Christ as a disciple, but he was a good friend of St. Peter's. And he will go to Egypt. St. Mark will go to Egypt, to Alexandria, to set up a colony of Christians. Now, these are some of the paintings that happen. They are not in this St. Mark's Cathedral, which is in the plaza in Venice. But take a look at the two paintings, and I'm going to take each one of them separately and talk to you about them, not only because it gives you some history of St. Mark, but it also gives you some sense of what Tintoretto did with his brush. This first one. This is called Finding St. Mark's Remains. Okay, there's a lot going on in this, and I can boil it down for you quickly with a couple of covers. Here's one. There are two men who have reached in and slung this body, which is St. Mark, down to this man who's trying to catch it. Now, St. Mark had been dead for some time, a long time, centuries by then. But the Venetian people wanted his relics back. Well, you can't show these two men throwing bones out of a casket or a sarcophagus down to somebody. So Tintoretto has shown the body coming down. And these two men up here were the ones from Venice who were traders and had gone to Alexandria and decided they probably could find this if they just talked to the right people and moved around, and sure enough, they did find it. Over here, you have two more figures. This is also St. Mark. And this is also St. Mark. This is St. Mark on the floor later, and this is St. Mark calling to these men saying, "Stop, that's me, you got it." Notice this figure. Every single time that Tintoretto did a painting, unless he was doing it gratis to get something else, it was done for a donor. And that is the donor right there, that man. That man had just been knighted. He'd been given this glorious satiny robe. And he insisted in the painting that Tintoretto show him wearing that robe and motioning towards the saint which had been found. That's not all that's going on in this picture. Look over here. You see this dark figure? That's Satan. This man is looking towards St. Mark for support, but he is trying to pull Satan away from having wrapped himself around this woman's legs. And she's so enthralled with what's going on up here, she's just not even paying any attention to the devil clinging to her down below. Back here, there are some other figures. They are still looking for the remains back here. But of course, this man is celebrating because they have been found. All of that's going on in that painting. The return of St. Mark's remains. Okay, first of all, I want you to notice this man. That's Tintoretto. He put himself in there in support of the finding of the relics of St. Mark to bring back to Venice. And then you have, of course you have the body, but you have a man here and you have a man here. They are the two merchants who went over to Alexandria and brought the body back. And look here, there's the donor. He's still wearing his robe. There are many other things going on in this painting as well, but one of the things that I want to call to your attention so that you are aware of it, whether I mention it again or not. Tintoretto will usually use his strongest and most intense colors in the foreground, and he will resort to whites and lights in the background, as he has done here. Now, if you notice up in the sky, there's lightning. These people are all running to get out of the storm. They're all moving this way to get under cover. What does that have to do with this? I'm not sure. But Tintoretto would add other stories, other areas of interest into his paintings. So looking at one of them can require quite a bit of concentration and a considerable amount of time if you really want to study it completely. This is one that also made him famous. This was done in 1548. This man is a slave. He had accepted Christianity. This is his boss. And this man is a pagan, and he doesn't want him to influence anybody else in his house. So he has decided that he is going to have his legs broken, both feet cut off, and his eyes and teeth gouged out. Well, look what happens. Tintoretto, who was famous for foreshortening and twisting bodies and also using, and you'll see this over and over, reds and blues, but softer tints of those than what you would have seen in a work by Titian. There is the man who is supposed to be meeting his fate, and up here, this is a foreshortened view of St. Mark. St. Mark is carrying his gospel, and he's pointing down because he is not going to allow the orders of this man to destroy the righteousness of this man. And if you look below, or look over here to the side first, there he is. And he's like starting to stand up because he can't believe what is going on in front of him. And what is going on in front of him is this scene. These figures, this man has a steel rod. He is going to try to gouge out his teeth or his eyes with it. There's a man down here who is trying to figure out how to break and or chop off his feet. But if you notice, around the figure on the floor are pieces of broken rope and hammers, and here's a man up here holding a broken hammer up to the man saying, look, this is just not going to work. I think maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Well, as a matter of fact, they do have to stop because the man is not hurt by any of this attention. And the man who was a patron of this piece, not the patron of the piece, but the man who was the reason for why this event occurred, eventually sees the strength of the Christian faith in his servant, and the good ending to that story is that he becomes a very devout follower himself. Notice the background. Notice how it gets lighter. There are, if you count them, and I'm not going to be giving you time to do that, there are 25 moving figures in this painting, twisting and turning, all of them. And all of them would have been started as models that Tintoretto had studied, sketched, and then transferred the ideas to the canvas. The Scuola Grande di San Rocco. This is the building. This building has two huge hallways, convocation areas in it. Some smaller rooms as well, but the primary rooms are that size. There's a boardroom on one of the floors, which is probably the next largest room. Now this is an opportunity for me to show you what happens when Tintoretto decides to play dirty to get a contract. First of all, the brothers who owned this, San Rocco, wanted it decorated. And you can see paintings on the walls at this level and painting at the altar. But they decided there were so many good artists in Venice that they needed to find out who would be able to do this best for them, and so they had a contest, and there were about 5 of them in the contest. So the first 4 presented their sketches and their ideas and spoke well of what their intentions were, and when it came time for Tintoretto to present his, he led them off to a small room, and on the ceiling there is an oval-shaped, and you'll see it in the next slide, there is an oval-shaped painting, and I'll show you what it is. But what he had done is he'd secretly taken the measurements for the space, and he had gone off to a studio, not only done the painting, but had it installed in the ceiling. Now all of that helps to gain him the commission to do the work. But also, look at this, 25% of the board members for the San Rocco were dyers, so they knew his father. Faustina's brother, his brother-in-law, even sat on the board. That also helped, but nevertheless, he wanted to make sure that he got that contract. And he and his assistants will work for many years decorating the interior. They paint 60 different works. These are done on canvas, and then they are attached to the surface that they're designed for. This is the one that won him, officially won him, the competition to do all of the paintings for San Rocco. This is San Rocco, the saint, and because Tintoretto had said to them, I have done this as a way to show you what my dreams are for this entire building. But I am going to donate this piece. This piece will not come down from the ceiling. It's still where he put it to this day. But I will donate this to you because it is out of respect for San Rocco, for the saint. Well, the brothers had a rule, and Tintoretto knew it. They couldn't refuse a gift that was given to the saint, so they would have to keep it no matter which artist they picked, and certainly it was him that they did choose. There is the saint, and above him, in a foreshortening position, is God flying towards him to bring him into heaven. God's arms are supported by 2 cherubim, and you can see all of these figures that are down here are angels. They all have wings. And then notice the background again and how much lighter it gets as he takes you further up into space as you stand there and look, literally almost look into the sky. It's into the painting, but it's almost like you're looking into the sky to see this piece. This is one of the other ones that he did in that same building. It's no wonder it took so many years to do it. This is called the Crucifixion. It will be the largest work that he does, and there are the dimensions for it. And included in here are many side scenes. I am not going to take the time today to try to go over all of them, but I will pick out a few things to you to help you better understand what's here. And to study this piece, because it's 40 feet long, you really have to move across in front of it to catch everything that's going on. There were two people who were also crucified at the same time as Christ, and one of the men asked him if he was the Savior, and when Christ said he was, and Christ said to him, "And you will be in paradise with me." This is that man, and he is looking towards the figure of Christ already mounted on the cross. This man's cross is being fitted into the hole in the ground where it will stand. This was a raised area, and the crosses were right immediately on the other side of it. Over here is the other man who said, "Bah humbug, I don't need that." And he has turned his head away from Christ, and he's looking on. Now notice something else. These figures are tied to their cross. Christ is nailed to his. But there are all kinds of figures going on in different directions, doing different things. Animals, people, young people, old people. Here's a close-up of the saved sinner. And here he is looking up towards Christ, and they're fitting the post into the ground down below. Here's the other side. You can see part of the other man back here, but you also can see other things going on. Digging the hole. These two men are rolling dice, maybe for Christ's garment that was taken from him. Nevertheless, that's what's going on in this little cave-like area. And then there are all kinds of other things going on with it too. Animals, donkeys, horses. It's a very, very busy piece. And yes, he did use many, many clay figures for his paintings. There's the one of Christ. Christ is being reached up to. This man right here is taking that stick with the sponge on it. And it's, of course, the story is he gets a sponge, it has vinegar on it because Christ has said, "I thirst." Brings it up to his lips. Christ takes that and wets his lips, and he looks up to heaven and said, "Father, it is finished." And he gives up his ghost. He gives up his life on earth. But that's the scene that's going on there. Now, besides that, in the foreground, you have Mary who has swooned, and you have other Marys, Mary Magdalene, John, other figures are here as well. It's quite an impressive work. Here's one that Tintoretto did, which is rather uncomplicated compared to what we've been looking at. This is called Madonna and Child. And then he does it again. And so, yes, folks, this man, like all of the other artists that we are studying, has done the same thing over and over again, but made different statements about it. And in this one, you notice that he has put Mary in the manger, up above, in the haymow, up here, not down here with the cows. And of course, there's Joseph. And Mary is identified by the halo that she's wearing. And again, as with his other works, there are all kinds of interesting things to visually wander around through and find, even the heavenly angels up above, showing through here in the ceiling. This one is called Christ at the Sea of Galilee. I have to say to you that I've lectured on this painting in the past, and I can lecture on just this one painting by Tintoretto for an hour. There's so much in it. So what I've had to do was to simply scoot across the top and pick out some things that I thought you would find interesting, and then perhaps maybe you'll take a look at it again some other time. When Tintoretto did this piece, he did it in a lot of blues, but you'll notice that he has Christ in the traditional blue and red. There were many people at that time in history, and certainly coming through the medieval time, who had no opportunity to learn how to read or to write. But they could understand by studying and looking, and our cathedrals are full of examples of how stories were told simply with images. But the images had to be identifiable, and so this figure of Christ in those colors was what would identify him as being Jesus the Christ. Now, if you take a look at this piece, you see he's pointing out to these men in the boat, and there are 7 of them. Let me give you a better look at Christ first. He's not really touching the ground. His feet are there, but is he in the water? Is he on the land? There's an etherealness about him that for Tintoretto was definitely important. You'll notice that he is wearing a halo, but it's very small. But he's pointing to the boat with the men in it. And there they are. These disciples were just a little bit confused after the crucifixion and after everything that had happened, and they had tried to get back some semblance of their former lives. And so a number of them were fishermen, so they've gone out in this boat and they've fished all night. And this man is pulling up yet another empty net. And Christ is saying to them, drop your nets on the other side of the boat. Drop your nets on the right side of the boat. And this is what the men are doing. And now they're motioning for help because the weight of the nets is such that they cannot pull it up. There are so many fish in it. You'll notice that the figure at the back is wearing a small halo, and that is John. John is managing this ship, this boat that they're in, and they are heading towards land. John is the one who will recognize Jesus and say, that is our Lord. And at that point then, Peter says, well, I'm not waiting for this boat to get to shore, and he steps out of the boat to walk towards Jesus on his own. In the background behind this piece, there's stillness, there's regalness, dignity here, there's action in here, and there's peace and quiet back here with this small village. So it's a combination of many different things, but it's a very fascinating piece to look into in even more depth. This piece that he did is also rather impressive. It's a large piece. And he shows Jesus getting ready to feed the 5,000. This is called the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. And this little boy is standing here with 5 barley loaves, well actually 4 now because Jesus has 1 in his hand, and there are 2 fish down here. Because he had says to Andrew, who is standing beside him, we have to feed these people. They've got to be hungry. And Andrew said, we can't possibly feed all these people. Well, that's beyond us. And Jesus said, no, it's not. Here, I have 5 barley loaves and I have 2 fishes. You put all the people in groups of 50 and have them sit around, get the other disciples and come over here, and we will feed the people. And of course, they feed all those people, and then when they're finished, they pick up leftovers, which it fills 12 baskets. Now, to take a look at this painting is an interesting little adventure. First of all, I think she owns the longest thigh in the world. Look at the length of that, from her hip to her knee. That is just really very, very, very extended. I think maybe maybe Tintoretto might have backed up a little bit with the fabric so that it doesn't look like her knee goes quite that far. However, there doesn't seem to be anybody in this painting who looks too hungry. I mean, they're all moving around, they're all doing things. The only person who looks like he might really need some help is this man who's being propped up by this woman right behind him. But the rest of them don't appear hungry, and they don't appear in need of anything. And this little boy right here is having a time of his life. He's found a small toy that he can tease a dog with, so that's what he's doing. Then if you notice, there are many, many, many lovely dressed women and only a few old men. There's a man over here, there's one back in here, there's one over here, but most of these are women. Notice something. This is the kind of clothing that would have been worn during the biblical period, and there is Christ in his colors. But this clothing is the clothing that was popular in Venice at the time that Tintoretto lived and painted. So this was to bring to the people in Venice this story so they could better relate to it, because the people were wearing, in the painting, were wearing the clothing that they were very comfortable with themselves. Everyone in the painting seemed to be moving a little. There's not the violent twisting that you've seen in some of the other pieces, but people are turning, they're in arrested points of action. And this painting was designed to hang high up on the wall. You see how large she is here, and then tapers here, and she's large here, and then she tapers up, because this is a painting you would stand below and look up at. You'll also notice something else. This woman and this woman are the same clay figure. He changed the color of the clothing and he repositioned the arm, but it's the same person, and he turned her head. Again, he took a lot of mileage from his modeling, his model pieces, and used them over and over again in lots of different ways. Just being aware of that makes looking at his work fascinating. This is a beautiful still piece that was done. This is Christ standing in front of Pilate. And Pilate has turned his head away, because he doesn't even want to look at what he's going to have to do. And if you notice that beside the man there is a jug, and water is coming out of it, and there's a tray that the water is falling into after it passes through Pilate's hand. Pilate wants to cleanse himself from having made a decision that he really wished he didn't have to make. There weren't any court stenographers at that time, but somebody had to keep records, and so we have a scribe down here at the bottom. And when Pilate has asked Jesus questions, he hasn't really answered. And so the scribe is sitting there. He's got the pen in his hand. He's waiting to write something, and he's wondering, if Christ doesn't say anything, what am I supposed to write? Big contrast between the darks and the lights, between the stillness and the nobleness of this figure, and all of the action and movement going on down, around, and below him. This is called the marriage of Cana. At the marriage of Cana, Jesus and the disciples were there. There's Jesus, and there is his mother Mary, because she was with him at that, according to the Bible. And at this point, Jesus hadn't performed any miracles. But this wedding, which was going to last a long time, certainly a couple of days, the host had run out of wine, and the deal was that you gave the people the good wine to begin with, and then you started to just give them, as they got drunk, you just give them lesser and lesser quality wine. Well, they ran out of all of the wine, and all they had left was water. And Mary says to Jesus, you have to do something about this. And Jesus says, no, Mother, it's not my time. She said, it's your time. And she's with his mother, and he was her son, and so it is the scene before the water is turned into wine that you're looking at. It is one of the most highly finished pieces that Titian does. You'll notice back here he's even added more color through the archways and the windows. And this is one of the pieces where he signed with his real name, and it's signed on this robe over here on this man. If you look over here at these two figures, they're coming out, they're thinking about bringing food out. This man's pointing at all this saying, I don't know what we're going to do. This is just getting out of control. One thing was leading to another. Here's a larger view of him again. And here's a woman who's pouring the last drops of water out for this woman. Now notice this woman and this woman. And then when I go back to the original painting again, look at them again. It's exactly the same figure, exactly the same. I don't know if they were twins there or not, but they certainly are exactly alike. Look, you can see them. There's one here, and there's one here. You'll notice too that this woman is signaling that there is no more wine because she's holding out her glass with nothing in it, and she's pointing to this man over here. Interestingly enough, Tintoretto has painted himself sitting there at the end of the table, hence the reason that he signed his real name on that robe. Here's another contrast for you. This was done by Titian. Notice the figure of John, the youngest of the 12, and how he seems to have fallen asleep out of boredom or just total weariness, but he is leaning on the table. The practice was at that time in history to show all of the disciples so you could see their faces, and maybe perhaps not Judas. Often Judas would be seated on the opposite side of the table. Notice what happens here. This is one done by Tintoretto. You have a waitress coming or waiter coming with bringing food. You have a great deal of confusion and people turning and twisting, and John still now just totally sad because Jesus has said, and he's wearing his traditional clothing, somebody was going to betray him. There's an overturned chair. Well, guess who that belongs to? Judas. If you notice, he's the only one in the painting who's not wearing bright colors. He's just wearing the browns. There's a woman sitting back here. Remember, when Tintoretto does paintings, he adds little vignettes here and there. And here are some people passing behind this scene. And they are, of course, much lighter, which is all Tintoretto. You'll also notice there's a man sitting here who's gotten some food. He's eating on his lap. He's got the bowl, and he has the food, and he has the napkin there. There are other things in this picture. There are belongings here. There's a cat over here curious about what this man might be finding when he lifts off the lid. All kinds of interesting things going on in the works that Tintoretto does. Tintoretto kept a sign in his studio, and he said he wanted to draw like Michelangelo, and he wanted to use the color of Titian. He does not draw like Michelangelo. He has his own style. Michelangelo's figures were much more masculine and muscular than what you see here. And Tintoretto's color is much different from Titian's. Titian's was brilliant. Tintoretto's will be tints and shades and softer colors. So it might have been his goal, but at the same time, Tintoretto ended up making his own statement. This is another Last Supper that he did. And again, he did many of his paintings over, but he would really completely reinvent them. Look where he put Jesus this time, right in the front. Now some of these colors are not as good as they could be, and I make a statement about that right here. This man painted, as he got older, he painted darker and darker colors. And he used bright light here and there. But to try to get this to a point where you, as the audience, can see what I'm talking about, I have to sometimes bring the color up to the point where I sacrifice. This all looks like green. It's not, it's blue. But I have to do that in order for you to be able to understand what's in the painting. Here's another dog, and this time the dog is even looking at Jesus. Tintoretto painted primarily religious scenes. Why? Well, first of all, he had a very deep faith. He understood the stories of the Bible, but most of the sites that requested work from him were churches, or they were official buildings where they wanted to present some of their beliefs to the public. He loved to paint, and he loved to paint fast and furiously, but he also loved to reinvent and reinterpret his own stories. This is probably the finest one. He did about 9. This is probably the finest one he did. He dies 2 years later, so he's an older man by now, and this painting is, quite honestly, quite dark. I've done what I could to brighten it, and I've been able to keep the red and the blue on Christ in this one. Now you'll notice that Christ is the strong light in this painting, and the other light is here, and that's it. There isn't any other bright light. All of the light that's reflecting off all of these figures is coming from there. And of course then the small halos that surround the heads of the disciples. Interesting perspective. He never stopped trying to get you to go further and further and further back into his paintings. And he was very successful with this diagonal line for the table, which carries you way back from, look at the size of these figures, and then look back here at these. If you look into the sky or the ceiling above the table and the room, you see little cherubs over here, and you see angels here who represent the Eucharist. So that is also going on now, not in the distance, but simply ethereally painted so that it's otherworldly. He added everyday chores to this piece. Here, this woman is unloading dishes. There's a little dog who's curious about what's going on. Unloading dishes and handing them to this man so he can put some fruit on it. This woman is looking over. There are all kinds of interesting things going on in these pieces. And Christ at this point is about to offer the bread and or the wine to his disciples. Tintoretto doesn't do many battle pictures. In fact, he only does 2, and I'm only going to show you one, but this one is curious, and it's a well-known story. So first of all, it's a large piece. So he sewed the canvas together about through here. Well, he wanted to make sure that nobody was aware of that, so look what he's done. He's taken this foliage and run it up through here, just to kind of break your line of vision so you wouldn't notice that. And he also, the subject is of course David slaying Goliath, and in the story David uses Goliath's own sword to cut off his head, and in this piece David is using a spear. And historians think that perhaps the reason that Tintoretto chose the spear was to remind people that once his head was cut off, that David would carry the head of Goliath into Jerusalem on the end of the spear. Many things are going on in this painting besides that scene. Back here, there are elephants and camels. Down here is a big ditch, and you can see people. These are the Philistines whose leader has lost his head, and they are climbing out of the ditch and away. Some of them are going over the fence already, but they are trying to get away from this as fast as they possibly can. Notice back here, the entire camp is moving away to get away from the threat of their own lives. This is a single piece. Some of the pieces that he did are on single canvases, and they are ones that you can find on a limited basis in museums around the world. This is one of those pieces, and this is to date about how much this painting is worth. The one that the Metropolitan Museum of Art has in New York City is the one of Christ at the Sea of Galilee with the 7 men in the boat. If you're ever up there, you want to certainly go and take a look at it. It's just fabulous. Okay, this is the church of San Giorgio Maggiore. I guess. Anyway, it's off the mainland of Venice. And it's a very important church, and three of Tintoretto's works are installed in that church. Now there's the church, and 2 very large pieces are in there. The one that you just saw of the Last Supper is up here, and the one I'm going to show you next is over here. This is it. This is the Jews on the desert. This is the Jews for the 40 years following Moses to get to the Promised Land. And Moses is in the painting, as well as a man who has a donkey. That it's really, the poor donkey is loaded with everything that the man could possibly bring out of Egypt with him. But down here, you have Moses talking to his brother Aaron. They say that when Moses came down from the mountain after getting the tablets, that light shone from him. And Titian has tried to show that as a halo, but then also as light coming out of his head. This painting, like many, many others, as you have seen so far with me today, is just loaded with other activities. There are all kinds of interesting vignettes, people who are tired and sleeping, people who are doing some kind of work or labor, just interesting things. And going back into this, there's a little more color back here, but he doesn't want you to spend a lot of time back here. His subject, his main area of interest is usually going to be towards the front of the composition. Back to his family for just a few minutes as I close up. Domenico Robusti was Tintoretto's oldest son, and I said before he was born the same year as his beloved daughter Marietta. This is his style of painting. He and his brother Marco and Marietta were extremely capable young artists, and they worked very, very comfortably with their father, and he had a great deal of confidence in them. Their father will run the studio after Tintoretto dies. Tintoretto seems to be healthy and hale and getting along just fine, and all of a sudden he gets extremely severe stomach cramps and a very raging fever. It's not the plague, but he has something. He lasts for 2 weeks. He can't eat, he can't sleep, and he dies. Marco will take over running the studio until his death, which comes along 2 years later, and then Domenico will run it. And he successfully ran the studio till he was 75 years of age. They were responsible young people. And of course, at that point, he's not young anymore. He's an old man. Things to remember about Tintoretto. He never turned down a commission. He could paint fast and furiously, so why would he turn down an opportunity to express himself with his brush and his paints? The grand halls and the churches of Venice sparkle with his amazing talent. You want to see his work, go to Venice. It's there. And he died at 75. He died only 4 years after his darling daughter Marietta had died. There is his tomb. And there again is the canal leading up to the church, where you can see he would be buried. Years later, Domenico and also Faustina will join them, and their tombs are also in there. So if you go to that church, be sure to look for all of them. This is a portrait he did of himself. Remember, he liked bold foreshortening, he liked twisting the figures, he liked turning the figures, he liked drapery, but he loved softer colors. He was innovative, he was modern, he had emotional drama in his work, he showed a lot of action. How can there be any wonder that artists from France and England and Germany and other countries would not flock to Venice to see the work not only of Titian, but also of Tintoretto? And he was very clever with how he got his commissions, as I have already pointed out to you. He put into his religious works the poetry that was in his soul, and I think you can see that or have noticed that as I have talked about him. And he did many portraits. They were quick and easy for him. He did many portraits and he did mythology. But again, with time, all I can do is give you a taste of who he was, explain how he worked, and then hopefully you on your own will go to study his work and enjoy it even more. And you can look more closely at it. Jacopo Tintoretto Robusti. He was the last of the great Renaissance artists. He was a fantastic artist, a great man, and left the world many, many beautiful gifts. Now, next week, you can send comments today or anytime during the week to me or to Ask the Presenter at willowvalley.org. And if you look below, you'll see a different painting and a slightly different style, because next week I'm going to talk to you about an amazing man named Caravaggio. Michelangelo is his first name. But anyway, he will not live for very long, but his work will absolutely amaze you at just what he is able to do and say and tell you about the subjects that he paints. Email for this particular artist, for the one that I just talked about, and the last thing I have to show you is this book. If you look at the book, here it is. It's called Look to the Shore. Tintoretto is one of my favorite artists, and so therefore when I did the painting, or when I did when I've done lectures on Tintoretto, I have become fascinated with how he worked. And so therefore, I have created this book, which includes not only some of the paintings that you saw today, but many others as well. And in this book, you'll find that there's background on the stories in the Bible, and on Tintoretto, and on where he lived, and how he lived, and a lot of other interesting information. Any of the books that you want are on Amazon.com. It's easy to get to. And once you get there, the one from last week on Titian, it's there. This one is there. I have some on Caravaggio that I'll bring next week just to point them out to you. And again, as I've said before, this is not a marketing ploy of mine, but if you're interested, I want you to know where to go to get as much information as possible in as small a book as possible. And so that's what this is about. I hope that you've enjoyed Tintoretto. I hope you've enjoyed seeing the contrast between the Tintoretto and Titian. And I really hope you'll join me next week for Caravaggio. He studies their works. He's a younger man. Now I think I have some questions, so I'll see what they are and then we'll be finished. Yes.
Yes, we do have a question this morning. You mentioned that Tintoretto studied other artists such as Michelangelo. Mm-hmm. And also that Tintoretto did not travel from Venice. Mm-hmm. The sketch of the reclining figure that you showed reminded this person of Michelangelo's male figures in Dawn and Dusk, mm-hmm. and also Day and Night in Florence. Mm-hmm. Did Tintoretto make short trips to study, or were there many examples of Michelangelo's work in Venice? That's the first question.
That is a really good question. And the answer is yes. There were examples of Michelangelo's work in Venice. There were other artists who traveled all around, and they traveled to Rome, and they visited the places where Michelangelo had done his paintings and the sculpture, and at some future time I'll talk to you about all of those with you and about that incredible artist. But they brought back sketches and ideas, and so a lot of those were very authentic. So he had resources that were there and available for him.
The second question is, how did artists become familiar with other artists' work during that time period?
Word traveled fast. It traveled across the land and it traveled across the sea. People who knew about something that really impressed them would tell others. Even though Tintoretto did not travel, Titian did. You'll find Caravaggios all over southern Italy. So these artists moved around, and people also moved around, and in the process, they would discuss with each other these interesting people and their work that they had seen or the people that they had met. So the news traveled not by newspaper. We didn't have any then. We don't have Gutenberg and the press yet, but we do have people who write letters and who do sketches and who speak with each other and share their ideas.
Thanks, Elaine.
You're welcome. Now, next week, same time, here, Caravaggio. You're going to love them. See you then. Bye-bye.